So why don't we get started? Um, Anyways, I already said it, but again, we are so thrilled today to be joined by really someone who needs no introduction, but I'm just going to give one anyway. Stacey Abrams. She has a law degree from Yale. She served as Democratic leader in the Georgia House of Representatives. Is a published author. She's got a great podcast and a new Substack. She does it all. But beyond that, she's been a leader at the front lines of protecting democracy for years. She organized here in Georgia for many years, thinking long term, registering voters, and working around anti voter laws to expand ballot access. And part of that is why she launched Fair Fight after her 2018 run for governor to fight back against voter suppression. She isn't involved in the day to day at Fair Fight anymore, but she still joins us for fun things like this. And her vision and her mission are still driving our work today. Stacey, it is great to have you.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here. I see you brought a friend.
Yes.
Yes. Hey, everyone. Hey, Stacey. Good to see you. My name is Amr Badat. I'm the Southern States Director and Senior Advisor at Fair Fight. Excited to be joining Stacey, Max, and everyone who's joining us virtually here today to talk about some really important developments that we are seeing happening in our democracy and trying to get an understanding of how we should put everything together, comprehend everything that's going on. The latest development that we saw that I'd love to talk to you about, Stacey, is Donald Trump's executive order, or the upcoming executive order that he announced on Truth Social in a rant about mail-in voting and voting machines. He claims that the states are just the agents of the federal government and that he's going to lead the movement to ban mail-in voting and to ban voting machines across the country. And it is authoritarian on its face. We know that. It fits exactly into a framework that you have talked about, Stacey, the 10-step kind of playbook for authoritarianism. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on this executive order, how it fits into the 10 steps, what the 10 steps are, and help us understand what's going on here.
Thank you. And I just want to start by saying, while it was an honor to found Fair Fight, I have just been so privileged to watch it grow and continue to do extraordinary work, and that you and the broader team, including your CEO, Lauren Grow-Wargo, just are really pushing the conversation forward in ways that matter so much. And it matters the most in this moment because we are indeed not on the cusp of authoritarianism. We're pretty much solidly in there. And as you mentioned, Amr, there are 10 steps. So step one, you have an election. In democracies in the 21st century, we no longer have the military juntas that come in and overthrow the government. That's not the modern way to do it. What you do is you win an election, but the elected person is a populist, authoritarian, autocrat, wannabe. You insert political dynamic there. But what it usually portends is that it's the last election for a while. The way they make that happen is that the strong man, and it's always a man. Step two, you expand the reaches of executive power. You have executive orders that are issued that have absolutely no bearing on the law as it stands. And it's insistent on saying that the executive possesses more power than the people gave. But you can't just seize that power. You have to diminish the competing powers in a democracy. And in a democracy, those two competing powers are the legislative branch and the judicial branch. In the course of most of the authoritarian regimes that rise, they usually compromise the legislative branch by getting their own folks elected and jettisoning those they don't like. And on the judicial side, they usually dismantle the judiciary, neuter it, or do something that makes it complicit. And that's exactly what we've seen. This didn't happen overnight, but it has come to an inflection point at the exact right moment. You have a complicit judiciary that is essentially abdicating responsibility, saying we can't stop him from doing anything because we don't have enforcement power. But they are wholly allowing and permitting and, in fact, suborning and encouraging his behaviors and the behaviors of the political party behind him. And that's why it's so important that we not just acknowledge the president, we have to acknowledge that the Republican trifecta that exists between the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive branch. And that is a complicit Congress that, even though it has a very narrow margin of majority, has wholly surrendered its governing power to the presidency and allowed this unfettered expansion of power. So that's step two. Step three. Step three once you've done that, you go to step 4, because if you control the competing powers and you've expanded your power, the next thing you need to do is break government so it doesn't work for anybody else. Authoritarians work best when people think that democracy has failed. And that's why you saw them gut civil service. That's why we saw not just the breaking of things, but the defunding, the bankrupting of various things. I was walking through the airport yesterday, and a young man who worked for USAID has lost his job because even our international dominion, our work helping others, has been completely gutted. And so when you do that, you do it not just because you want to make government smaller, you want to make government inept, because you want people to think that the only way for success to come to your family is to let an authoritarian strongman deliver it. That gets you to step 5. Step 5 is when you start to put loyalists in place. You put someone in charge of the Department of Justice who understands nothing of justice. You put a television personality in charge of the Department of Defense. You put another television personality in charge of the FBI so he can, investigate your friends, or his enemies. You put you make certain that you go through, I think at this point, 7 different IRS appointees trying to find someone
Yep.
who's willing to weaponize the IRS against nonprofit organizations and those you don't like. But you make certain that the people who are in those key positions are loyal not to a political ideology or even the people, they're loyal to the strongman. That gets you to step 6. Step 6 is when you make sure nobody understands what's happening, so you break communication. You demonize the critical media. You gut and defund PBS and NPR. You make certain that you extort money from your existing broadcast stations so that they feel that they can't tell the truth anymore. So CBS bends the knee because they watched ABC bow, and NBC is trying to figure out how they navigate it. Uh, But what's happening is that they are doing their best to squeeze out truth so that propaganda becomes the only information people have. And so you also watch the rise of Sinclair News, the FCC
Mhm.
that not only allowed the CBS Paramount merger and put in place protections for political ideologies they don't like or that they like to push out those that they don't like. The other piece of what they've done, and it's happening quietly, is that they're about to get rid of the ownership requirements, which would allow Sinclair News to basically have complete dominion over local news. And if you've ever listened to a Sinclair News broadcast, it's basically a miniaturized version of Fox that crowds out local information and only fills it in. And the reason that matters is that if we don't know what's happening, we don't know what to trust. And in the absence of trust, you go with propaganda. That gets us to step 7. Step 7 is that you have to blame someone for all the things you've broken and everything that's wrong and for the things you'll never be able to fix. So you kidnap immigrants off the street and you put them in concentration camps and gulags. You go after DEI because every community of vulnerability, every marginalized community, every community that relies on democracy to ensure its participation has to be silenced. And so we've watched this vigorous attack on DEI. Step 8, you have to make certain that nobody comes to save them. There can't be any Avengers. So you go after the law firms that have been providing the legal supports to actually protect civil society. You go after civil society itself. You threaten philanthropies and you do a hit list. You make certain that if you are a university that's teaching people how to think and how to understand the world they're part of, you seize their money and then accuse them of essentially what you are guilty of. And so you break everything. You go after protesters and organizers. You go after the nonprofit organizations doing the work of the people because the people can't know the government should work. That gets us to step 9. Step 9 is when you essentially incentivize private violence in our communities by militarizing our police. The secret police that we have heard of in other places exist in the US today. They're called ICE. They're called the National Guard. When the National Guard is roaming the streets of DC and Los Angeles, pretending to hold law enforcement powers that they do not possess, that is step 9. And it's designed to not only quiet dissent, it's designed to scare us into believing that our voices are actually going to create harm. And so we have to be quiet so hopefully we won't be the victims of the violence that we are afraid will meet us. And that gets us to step 10. And step 10 is where Fair Fight sits squarely in the solution set of. And that's when you try to break elections so that we can't have anymore. You don't say you're going to get rid of democracy. It's never that blatant because you like the vestige of democracy to cloak the autocracy that you have. And what happens here is that Texas does mid-decade redistricting, but more importantly, they do it by threatening the people who were actually told to defend those they represent. So you find Representative Nicole Collier locked inside of the chambers in the state of Texas because she had the temerity to do her job. You have Georgia purging 478,000 voters. But across the country, you see them making it harder to register and stay on the rolls, harder to cast a ballot, and harder to make certain that ballot gets counted. And those 10 steps to autocracy, we're full swing. And now I'm going to stop talking about it so we can talk about how we fix it.
Thank you for that. I mean, spot on. It really feels like we have witnessed all of these steps, or at least like miniaturized versions of them that are starting to escalate more on a daily basis. And I guess step 10 kind of fits into all this stuff that we're seeing right now. And Trump's new executive order, which we are calling Putin's Putin's elections order, because after meeting with Putin, essentially Trump just implemented his orders and said, I'm going to get rid of all mail balloting. I'm going to take over all the voting machines. Does that fit into step 10? And how does it interact with Texas and with other states that are trying to do mid-decade redistricting? And one aspect of that too that I would love for you to take for our audience, what is the significance of the fact that this is happening mid-decade?
Okay. So if you're watching this, you probably know a little bit about it, but let me talk about why redistricting happens. Every 10 years, we have a census in the 0 years. So every decade we have a census. That tells us how many people live in the country, not how many citizens we have, not how many people of color we have. It tells us how many people live in the United States. And based on those numbers, political lines are drawn to apportion residents across legislative districts. Only citizens can vote in federal elections and most state elections. In fact, all state elections right now. But the whole point of it is you use these numbers to tell us who gets to vote. The lines are then drawn so that you have communities of interest. You want democracy to reflect the needs of the people, and so you try to put people together using geography primarily, but because of the nation's history of bad action, we have also acknowledged that race is a strong predicate for either having access to democracy or not. So you make sure that you pay attention to those communities so that they can also have representation. What Texas is doing is trying to vitiate all of that. We watched this start with the Shelby decision in 2013. It got accelerated with a common cause decision that said that states could do they couldn't at the time, they couldn't do racist stuff, but they could do all the political stuff they wanted. Although in the South, we know political and racist tend to sit side by side, cheek by jowl.
Was that the political gerrymandering is beyond the
Exactly.
courts?
Yeah. Exactly. So the Supreme Court said, well, you can't violate the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which precludes racial gerrymandering, but you can do it if it's politically sound and it's only because the politics are good. Then you had the Brnovich decision, which said, well, when we said Section 2, what we meant is that you have to be able to prove that they were sitting in a dark room with smoke and, saying, ha, 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 we're going to go after
Smoke is required.
insert this community here. And so you add those three together, Shelby, Common Cause, Brnovich, and then you get to where we are today, which is two things happening. Texas saying, we don't like the fact that too many people of color are sending too many Democrats to Washington, D.C. And so we are going to redraw the maps in the middle of the decade. The numbers haven't changed dramatically, but we don't think they're going to help us. So we're going to change and rig the rules so that only the people we want can win the elections. And the reason this is so critical is it's happening at the same time the Supreme Court is also considering the Louisiana case, which may completely eliminate any sensitivity to race at all. The reason this matters is if you want to break democracy, make certain that the communities that have been the margins, and therefore the reason that we've seen a tipping point, make sure they are silenced. And Texas is an experimentation state. It is a laboratory because if it works there, it's going to spread to Ohio and Indiana. And what we're watching California try to do is push back. But the reason this matters so much is if they can game the system so that in the 2026 midterms, Democrats cannot win, then what that means is that trifecta we talked about gets even stronger because the Senate maps are not in our favor. But they're not gone yet, but they are not nearly as favorable to us as the congressional maps are.
The House is the most winnable chamber by far.
Exactly.
Yeah, and one of the most nefarious parts about a lot of this is that not only is it going to impact Congress and representation at the congressional level, but the court case, the Louisiana court case that you mentioned, Stacey, Section 2 also applies to state legislatures. It applies to counties and school boards and city councils. And so
Mhm.
not having Section 2 will eviscerate representation for Black people and communities of color across all levels of government, which is a really scary thought. One thing I wanted to ask you, Stacey, you mentioned at the outset, we don't really have military juntas coming in through the streets and you know televising the takeover of governments anymore, and we have this kind of staged process where we have a bunch of things happening in parallel and in staggered fashion. They seem disconnected, but they're actually all part of the same phenomenon. That makes it difficult to explain to people and highlight for people what is actually happening, like connecting the dots for people. We do have now the military entering our cities. We have the National Guard going into LA, going into Washington, D.C. So we have something that is like a tank rolling through the streets. But can you talk a little bit about how we highlight these things for people, how we connect the dots and get people to mobilize? And then also, what can people do? It feels overwhelming. What are the actions that people can take to help slow the playbook that you've talked about?
Sure. So we often hear people refer to the 38 days it took Hitler to take over
Mhm.
Germany. We forget that Viktor Orban took 10 years to take over Hungary. That if you look at what Bolsonaro was able to do, it took about 4 years, although they were able to push him out through elections, although we have a president here who's trying to manipulate, Brazil in order to keep him from having to have responsibility. Duterte in the Philippines, it took less than a year, but it wasn't 38 days. So the reality is the speed of the takeover often depends on the size of the government and the structure. And the United States is the most diverse democracy in the world. And therefore, the sort of plain language authoritarian rise doesn't work here because we know to look for. We've seen enough on the History Channel to know what that looks like. But the problem is once it comes, it's here. And Matt, you said it earlier. It's microsites, but the problem is it's kind of like a photo mosaic where if you take
Mhm.
small images that are images of themselves and you put them together, you can create a whole new picture. And people are so focused on the micro images, they don't realize that a new picture has been created. But we can reverse engineer that. And that goes to your question, Amr. One, we have to recognize that the census is not a once a decade intrusion of privacy, it's a 10-year organizing opportunity. So when I created Fair Fight, I also created an organization called Fair Count. That focuses on the census. We use the census to organize folks. People need to know that being counted is how you count. That the reason Marjorie Taylor Greene wants to redo how the census works is because she doesn't want people, immigrants in particular, to be counted. But if you count everyone, that means you have to serve everyone. So we need to pay attention. That's our first job. Pay attention to what's happening. Don't get overwhelmed by the information, but don't isolate yourself from that information. Number two, we got to show up. And that's why Fair Fight is so important and other organizations that do this work across the country. It's why the Texas Organizing Project is doing such important work. It's why around the country, we have to stand up and support any local or state organizations or national organizations fighting for voting rights because voting rights are under attack. The best way to seize democracy is to break it from the inside and then convince people that they never had it to begin with. And we saw that they've tested a lot of these models here in Georgia, down in Florida, over in Texas, but Ohio isn't immune. We have states across this country, Mississippi, that are doing their best to break
Mhm.
the mechanics of democracy. We're not going to see what we saw in the 1960s. Like I said, you no longer have the military juntas coming in to overthrow governments, but you also don't have the dogs and the hoses. What you have instead are rules. You have administrative impediments. You have blocks that sound logical on their face until you look at what they're actually doing. For example, what's being purged in Georgia, that will hit a lot of military families because they're not using good data. They are using the fact that you have to change where your magazine goes. And if you're changing your magazine t- tag, and that can make you lose your participation in democracy, that's a problem. It doesn't sound bad until you realize that military families get moved around. And it may just be one person who has to change their address form, but now their whole family is in jeopardy of not being able to participate in our elections. And then the largest thing we have to do is make certain we aren't just focusing on the federal government. Yes, Congress matters. Yes, we need to pay attention to the redistricting. But to your point, Amr, we've got to pay attention to state and local issues, because those school boards that are deciding if our children can read books that remind them of what democracy means, that gets decided by these maps. The state legislatures that now have to implement the horrible cuts that are coming because of the terrible mega bill, those decisions will be made by state legislatures. And if they think they can't win based on those terrible bills, they're going to try to change who gets to go to the state legislature. The dismantling of the Department of Education is directly tied to the state's budget for educating your child. So we've got to be willing to not just pay attention and help those organizations. We've got to recognize that we've got to play on all fronts. But here's the thing. We cannot do everything everywhere all at once. Great title for a movie, terrible mission statement.
Great movie, too.
It is. But I ask everyone to pick one thing. And if this is your thing, then make this your thing. But pick one thing that you're going to focus on and make that the thing that you focus on every week. Do something every week on those 10 steps to autocracy, to authoritarianism. Figure out the step you're going to block. And for a lot of us, it's blocking the step that's going to eviscerate our elections. Because if we don't have access to our democracy, we lose access to our future. And we know it happens because if you watch what has happened in every nation state that has become an authoritarian regime, what has happened first is that the people give up. They start to believe it was never theirs to begin with. That's why voter suppression is so pernicious. When you convince someone that their vote doesn't count, they start to believe their lives don't count. And if they believe that, then what starts to happen is that their futures don't matter. And we are the ones who have to stop that from being true.
Couldn't have said it any better. On that last note, staying positive, keeping going, you've been in this fight for a long time. What keeps you going in these worst moments?
I look at three things. One, my grandfather, my mother's father, was born 25 years after the end of slavery.
Hmm.
And within a generation, his daughter, my mom, became the first person in their family to finish high school and go to college. And then I had the extraordinary privilege of becoming the first Black woman in American history to stand as governor for a state for a major party, and it happened to be in the Deep South. So the trajectory of history says that things will get better. The second is that my parents were civil rights activists as teenagers. My dad got arrested at the age of 14, signing Black people up to vote in Mississippi. And just this past year, with Fair Fight's help and Fair Count's help, we saw the transformation of electorates in Mississippi, where more and more people are starting to believe that their rights are real and that they have the right to representation at the local level and at the state level. But the third is I have 6 nieces and nephews. They are the first generation to lose civil rights in their lifetime since Reconstruction. I refuse to let that be the legacy that we leave. I refuse to believe that that is what they will know of America's promise. And so what keeps me motivated is that I know that the arc of history bends towards justice, but I also know that arc needs us pulling on it as hard as we can, doing as much as we can. And that's why Fair Fight matters so much. That's why the organizations doing this work, it's why this Substack and what you were going to tell folks to pay attention to matters so much. I'm going to plug, of course, Assembly Required, my podcast, and Assembly Notes, my Substack. But all of this comes together because if we want people to stay informed, we've got to show them why they can do something about it. They not only want us to feel isolated, they want us to feel powerless. And it is our power. It's our rights, and it is our right. And together we can make things work. I know it.
If our votes didn't have power, they wouldn't be working so hard to block us. Thank you so much, Stacey. I know we got to go. One quick reminder for folks out there. If you know someone in Georgia, tomorrow is the deadline to be purged. So you got to contact the Georgia Secretary of State, contact your local elections office, go to our website, fairfight.com/stop the purges, enter in your information, make sure you're not on the purge list.
I'm going to add one thing to that, though. Once you do that, if you don't know someone being purged, make sure that over the course of this week, you email and text and call your state legislators because they need to understand that you are outraged. The silence that happens in between sessions gets turned into consent. And so even if you're not affected by the purges, Tell someone you know to make sure that they check, but also express your disappointment and your determination to do something about it. If they know, I used to be there. If we know that you're paying attention, it's a lot harder to get away with the things that they do.
Absolutely.
Absolutely right. Thanks so much, Stacey. Always a joy to talk to you. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for
Take
having me.
care.
I appreciate it.
Appreciate you. Till next time.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay. So, okay. I know that 10 steps was long, but it felt like the right.
No, well, and the very last point, that piece about silence in between sessions. Oh, here you go.
Okay. You can have your phone back.
You mean